Okay, so in the previous video we looked at Adams' loop theory, and with particular reference to the open loop element of the theory. Now we're going to go on in this video to look at level 2 and level 3 closed loop theory, and look at Adams' closed loop theory as a theory of how we learn. Okay, so Adams' closed loop is going to be explained here, and we've got level 2 closed loop that we're going to go through first. Now you can see here that we've got a similar model to the one in the open loop. However, there's this significant difference of a perceptual trace. Now the perceptual trace, this is going to be your first mark. Okay, your perceptual trace controls or adjusts movement, and it does this by comparing what's going on in terms of our movement. So it compares the movement with the memory trace. Now we've got level 2 feedback here, because this feedback that's identified here is kinesthetic feedback. And this comes really quickly. So what we've got here is a short feedback loop, and the adjustment happens subconsciously. Now the example I would use in the exam is a skier losing balance. So if we look at our model, what we've got is a stimulus or input. So the skier is approaching the side of a run. The perceptual mechanism filters out all the irrelevant information and makes sense of what's going on. We then need to produce a decision or a motor program. So we need to produce a response to this stimulus. So our memory trace then delves into our memory and finds a motor program to allow us to turn. Okay, our perceptual trace will then compare our turn as we start to turn to the motor program. Now, as I said, we've got a skier losing balance. So as we start to turn, we hit a patch of ice and we start losing balance. So this feedback then travels up, and our perceptual trace compares what we should be doing, so turning nice and smoothly, not losing balance, to what's going on. And what is going on is this skier is losing their balance as they turn, they're slipping or skidding on the ice. So our perceptual trace will then be able to adjust this movement, so they'll turn a little bit harder into their turn, or they'll turn their skis a little bit further up the mountain to slow them down a little bit, and they'll lean into the mountain a little bit more to maintain that balance. Okay, so here we have Adams' loop, and this is level 3, and it's a closed loop again. So again, we've got a feedback loop, but this time the feedback loop, as you can see, is much longer. It's a much longer feedback loop, and it will take a little bit more time to adjust. So that's what we're going to put here. So our first point would be longer feedback loop, which means it takes longer to adjust movement. And the reason for that is that we've got visual and auditory feedback coming in instead of kinesthetic feedback. Okay, so we actually need to think about this. So it involves conscious thought or decision making. Now we know that because once we've performed the action, we've then got this visual and auditory feedback that then goes into our perceptual mechanism and goes to our memory trace. So we have to use our memory to compare what's going on in terms of the movement with what's supposed to be going on in our motor program or our memory trace. Now, as with the other closed loop, once the performer has made that comparison, if there is a mismatch between the memory trace and the perceptual trace, then the performer needs to adjust. Okay, and the example that I would use in the exam is any open situation, but my example would be a ball hitting the net in tennis. Okay, because the performer would have put in place a once the movement or once the ball had been returned by their opponent, the performer would have put in place a motor program. Okay, and we would have had that movement into the position. So if it was coming onto their backhand, they would have moved into position and they would have got their backhand or been prepared to perform a backhand. Let's say it's a backhand drive down the line. And once that ball hits the net, they then have to take that information in. They use their visual feedback and their perceptual mechanism then makes sense of the ball hitting the net, which means they then need to come up with a new motor program. Okay, so the perceptual trace has to compare all of that information. So what's gone on to the memory trace. Now obviously there's going to be a mismatch, so they have to change the motor program or produce a new motor program from the memory trace. Right, finally we're just going to look at how Adams' loop theory can be used to explain how we learn. Now we've already said, so this will be a nice little summary, but movement is initiated by the memory trace. And I'm just going to put down here motor program, because that's effectively what we are initiating or sending to the muscles. Now during performance, movement is adjusted by the perceptual trace. And it compares what's going on. As we said, it compares our movement to what should be going on in our motor program, or sorry, in our memory trace. So if there's a mismatch between those two, so a mismatch between the movement and the memory trace, then we have to alter that movement. Okay, so I'll put an equals there. we alter the movement. Now the correct movement is stored as a motor program. Or a memory trace. So learning, according to Adams' closed loop theory, learning becomes a process of eliminating these errors. These errors or mismatches.